Good afternoon, everybody. If I haven't virtually introduced myself to you yet, my name is Jack Laserchak, and I am a developer at Chariot Solutions. The human brain is one of the most complex and least understood organs in the human body, or so we've been told by a bunch of people's brains. This seemingly highly advanced biological computer is far from perfect, though. Our mind plays tricks on us. Turns out we can play tricks right back. Here to explain how we can make use of content strategy and design choices to leverage those cognitive biases for good is content strategy advocate David Dylan Thomas. Before I hand things over, I just wanted to give a big thanks to David and to everybody watching remotely today for making this possible, the sponsors as well. Though it's unfortunate we cannot meet in person this year, I'm still very glad that we're able to do this and that we're able to spend this time together, even if it is remotely. So thank you again. Over to you, David.
Thanks so much. And again, thank everybody for coming. We're here for Design for Cognitive Bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. If you would like to use them for evil, we can discuss that too, just in a different talk. So I am, the hashtag for this, if you want to tweet while we're doing all this, is Fight Bias. And my name is David Dylan Thomas, and I'm content strategy advocate at Think Company, an experienced design firm. And I am also the creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast, which is a podcast I used to do about, wait for it, cognitive bias. So I want to talk a little bit about how I came to be the host of this podcast. And it all starts a few years ago when I saw Iris Bonet give a talk about gender equality by design. It is a fantastic talk. It's on YouTube. I suggest you go find it. If you leave this talk now and go watch it, I won't feel offended. It's that good. But one of the main points she makes is that a lot of the bias that we see in the world today, it could be gender bias, it could be racial bias, isn't necessarily someone actively hating Black people or actively hating women. A lot of it is pattern recognition. And what she means by that is, imagine that you are hiring a web developer, and the image that might come to your mind unprompted when you hear those words might be skinny white dude, right? And it's not because you inherently think that white men are better at programming than anybody else, but in your life, that may have been the pattern that you saw built up over places that you've worked or images you've seen on TV. So if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit that image, you kind of start to give it the side eye. When I saw that something as pernicious as racial or sexual bias could come down to something as simple and, dare I say, human as pattern recognition, I decided I needed to learn everything I could about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is from the Rational Wiki. It is a page of cognitive biases. There's well over 100 here. And I realized I am not going to figure this all out in one day. So I took one a day. Every day I would look at a different bias, try to learn about it. Next day, move on to the next one. And this turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And so my friends were eventually like, Dave, please just get a podcast. So that's what I did. So for this talk, obviously, it makes sense for us to decide what is cognitive bias. And at the end of the day, it's basically a series of shortcuts your mind is taking. So you need to make something like 1 trillion decisions a day. And even right now, I'm making decisions about how fast to talk, what to do with my hands, where to look. And if I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I would never get anything done. So our mind spends most of the time on autopilot, and that's good. But those shortcuts eventually, occasionally lead to error. And we call those errors biases. Here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And basically, the way it shows up is if you are playing a game where you have to roll a die and you need a really high number, you will throw that die really hard. If you need a really low number, you'll roll it really gently. And we all know, it makes absolutely no difference how hard you throw the die, but we like to think we have control when we don't, and so we embody that need for control in how we throw the die. One that I find is really interesting for designers to think about is called survivorship bias. And it can be illustrated by the story of Abraham Wald. Abraham Wald was a refugee in World War II. He came to the States, and he was extremely smart, PhD mathematician. And he was put in a room with a bunch of other scientists, and the army was trying to figure out, hey, we have all these planes that keep getting shot down. Can you help us figure out where to put the armament on these planes so they don't get shot down so much? And lots of scientists in the room, and most of them looked at the planes and said, hey, you see where all those bullet holes are? Put the armament there. Our man Abraham looks at the same planes and says, no, you got to put the armament where you don't see bullet holes. And they were like, what are you talking about? Well, in that room were the planes that made it back. They needed to be worried about the planes that got shot up so bad that they went down. And those planes obviously got shot where these planes weren't. So they were judging by the survivors, and what they should have been looking at was the unhappy path. And a lot of what I talk about today with designing for cognitive bias has to do with being willing to think about that unhappy path very carefully. Now, for me as a designer and a content strategist, I first ran into this when I started, designing websites. And we had my very first client. We had a homepage we created for them, and we were sure they were going to love this homepage. They did not love this homepage. And we went through 4 or 5 more rounds before we finally settled on a homepage that everybody liked. And I started to realize, wait a minute, all the web pages that I see on the internet, they aren't the first choice. This is just what got through committee. In fact, the entire designed world around us is made up of 5th or 6th choices. So it's important to remember that as we kind of move around in the world. Now, confirmation bias is one you've probably heard of, and it's exactly what you think, right? You have an idea in your head, it gets stuck there, and no matter what you see, you just look for evidence to confirm that idea. And if you see anything that contradicts that idea in any way, you say fake news and you move on. One of the most illustrative examples of this came during the Iraq War. So the whole idea was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. We needed to go in there. It's a very compelling argument. As it turns out, not so much with weapons of mass destruction. But even, and in fact, it was 1 year into the war, 2004, President Bush explicitly says, hey, yeah, there's no weapons there. By 2015, all right, over 10 years later, 53% of Republicans still believed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and 32% of Democrats. 51% of Fox News viewers also believe that. And if you want to think of a source that was going to confirm that belief, there was one right there. So it's once that idea gets stuck in there, even if the president says it's not there, it kind of doesn't matter. We're going to come back to this bias. Now, these are very, very difficult to fight. One reason is you may not know you have them. There's a bias called the bias blind spot, which basically goes something like, hey, I don't have any biases, but I'm sure all of you do. Now, part of the reason it's really hard to know if you have a bias is because 95% of cognition happens below the conscious level. Now, I've been working on a book about this, and originally I thought it was 90%, but when I did the research, I found out it was even worse than that. It's 95% of cognition. So the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you do know that you have the bias, you'll probably still do it. This is one of the most frustrating things that studying bias after bias shows you, is that there's usually no antidote. So there's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could ask everybody on this webinar to write down the last 2 numbers of their social security number. And if you wrote down a high number, and then I would say, okay, let's go bid on this bottle of wine. And if you wrote down a high number, you would bid higher for that bottle of wine. If you wrote down a low number, you would bid lower. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. Now, I could tell you all of that before we did the experiment, that, hey, here's this thing called anchoring. You're going to bid a certain way. Don't do that. Still do it. But it gets worse. I could say, hey, there's this thing called anchoring, and I will pay you cash money not to do it. Still do it. Now, the reason we need to care about this is because of a thing called choice architecture. And a good way to describe choice architecture is to think about going to the store to buy produce. You can remember when we used to be able to do that. We usually know, if you're the savvy shopper, not to grab from the produce on top, because that's where the grocer is going to put the produce that they're trying to get rid of, right? The older produce, right? And the reason they put it there is because they know people are lazy. They're going to reach for the thing right in front of them. That has been architected to favor the grocer. You could just as easily architect that display to favor the customer, right? And put the freshest fruit within the easiest reach. So think about the decisions that your user needs to make. And then think about how people actually make decisions, right? There's no such thing as a rational user. Remember, 95% of the time they're on autopilot. Now, the good news is there are content and design choices that we can make to help keep harmful cognitive biases in check, or perhaps leverage them for good. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So let's go back to that resume, right? As it turns out, in experiment after experiment, if you have a job in a male-dominated field and you have 2 resumes that are identical, except for the name at the top of the resume. If it's a male-dominated field, the male names will be moved forward, and the female or female sounding names will be kept back. Here's the thing. Why do we need that information? If you're the hiring manager, how does knowing the name help you figure out who you should hire? Think of it like a signal to noise problem. The signal in that resume is the qualifications, the experience. The noise is the gender or the race or whatever you're reading into as gender and race into that name. Now, the city of Philadelphia, in fact, did do a round of blind hiring for a web developer position, and they've learned two things. One, if you want to blind a resume, even in the high-tech world of web development, you need to have an intern physically print it out, get a marker, and redact it like a CIA document. Even after that, the second thing they realized is they would see a resume, a blinded resume with qualifications they liked, and they'd go to that person's GitHub file, GitHub portfolio to sort of see what they had done. And the second they went to the GitHub profile, of course, all the personal information was there. It ruined the experiment. So clever people that they are, they created a Chrome plugin that would redact all of the personally identifiable information in that profile. And then to complete the circle, they took that code and they put it back on GitHub. It's there right now if you ever want to use it to try blind hiring. Now, this isn't just for teaching people how to do a better job of hiring. This is also for robots who want to do hiring. So Amazon a while back had a AI hiring bot that was supposed to help recruiters figure out who to hire. And it, as it turned out, was very, very sexist. So sexist, in fact, that if it saw the name of a women's college on the resume, it would demote that resume. And they tried to figure out what is going on. Why is it only recommending men? So they looked at the training data. And sure enough, the data it was trained on was the last 10 years or so of resumes, which seems like a normal enough thing to do until you realize, what do all those resumes have in common? Most of them were for men. So the AI took one look at all of that and said, gee, you sure must like dudes, and just kept recommending dudes. Now, I am very much of the opinion that there are times when you should lie to AI, right? And show it the world you want instead of the world that we have, which is horribly sexist and racist. Because what you can end up doing, if you just have it train on what's there right now, is amplify the racism and sexism that's already there. Now, if you were to say that this was a tool to find out what biases were there already, great success, right? Like it tells you, oh, it's just hiring dudes. Maybe that's a bias we have in how we're hiring now. But if you're trying to use it to predict who you should hire, you really need to be more careful about the data you're putting in. Now, it goes both ways. If you think about service design, Amazon recently, I think inadvertently, created a less biased shopping experience with Amazon Go. So Amazon Go is a series of stores where you just walk in, take what you want, and leave, because Amazon can auto-magically deduct whatever you took from your Amazon account. An unintended, I think, side effect of this is a less racist shopping experience. So Ashley Clark Thompson wrote an article for CNET called "In Amazon Go, No One Thinks I'm Stealing." And a phenomenon you may know about is called shopping while black. And what it looks like is you go into a store and you have, let's say, overly aggressive customer service, right? Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? No, really, can I help you? Ashley experienced none of this on her trip because there were no cashiers. There was nobody there to be racist to her. So by removing that design element from service design, they actually created a less biased experience. We're also seeing this in the judicial system. San Francisco last year tried to implement blind charging. So the district attorney has incredible leeway in deciding who to charge when they receive a criminal report. The problem is, overall, people of color were being charged way more often than white people. So they said, again, similar to the blind resume, why do we need to know the race of the perpetrator? Why do we need to know the race of the victim? In fact, even where the crime happens can be biasing. So let's remove that information and let the DA only have the details of the crime itself, right, when making that decision of whether or not to charge. It's kind of early days to see how this has turned out, but that is something they're trying. Another really important bias to be aware of when sort of creating websites or digital experiences is called cognitive fluency. The way it works is that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, I will assume it's easy to do, whatever it's talking about. And then by the same token, if something looks like it's hard to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about is also hard to do. So I love pancakes. I had some this morning. If there were a way for me to virtually make pancakes for all of you, I would. This is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of crunched together and it's kind of hard to parse. And I look at that, and before I read a word, I think to myself, you know what? Pancakes are probably pretty hard to make. I don't think I'm going to make pancakes. Now, if I see a recipe with lots of big images, right, and tiny little, small bursts of text, I might glance at that and say, I bet that's easy to read. I bet pancakes are easy to make. Maybe I'll make some pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget it. We're making pancakes. Now, these are two different ways to find out how to use public transportation in Philadelphia. I took one look at the one on the left, and I said to myself, there is no way I'm using public transportation today. I'm just going to drive. Right? I look at the SEPTA app on the right, and again, I haven't read anything yet, but I can tell, you know what, that's probably going to be an easy experience. I bet it's not that hard to get to Philadelphia using public transportation. Now, we can't really do a live poll here, but I can tell you how this usually goes, right? I ask, which of the following is true? Rosa Parks was born in 1912, or Rosa Parks was born in 1914. And in most experiments, people vote for Rosa Parks was born in 1914. Now, she was not born in either. She was born in 1913, but 1914 usually tends to win, and here's why. If something is easier to read, we will assume it's more true. It gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. This has consequences. Now, what's going on here is that we love things that are easy to process because things that are easy to process give us certainty. And one thing I've noticed by looking at bias after bias after bias is in one way or another, they're all trying to solve for certainty. We love certainty and we hate uncertainty. So if something's easy to process, it just feels more true. And I'll give you an example. I could ask you, what did you get for your 5th birthday? There's a lot of uncertainty there. And I said, oh, did you get a truck? I think you got a truck. You wouldn't have a lot of faith in that answer, because it's hard to process. It's hard to remember. You can't be sure. If, on the other hand, I said, what did you have for breakfast? Well, you could recall that with pretty good certainty, right? You'd be pretty sure that what you have in your head there is true, because things that are easy to remember are easy to process. Things that rhyme are easy to process. Things that are easy to read are easy to process and easy to remember. So they feel more true. Now, this becomes really important when it comes to information that you need to believe is true, that can save lives. So many African Americans do not believe health information that comes from the government. In 2002, there was a survey that asked, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS. Only 37% of African Americans agreed with that statement. By the time you get to 2016, that number has gone down to 18%. Now, we could do a whole other webinar about why there are legit reasons for African Americans to have suspicion about health information coming from the government, but this is information that could save lives. So if it has to rhyme, if it has to be written in clear fonts and use plain language, so be it. And obviously, in this day and age, being able to believe health information is extremely important, especially accurate health information. So this is an area of concern, right? And like I said, I'm working on a book about this, and my editor very wisely said, okay, that's a great example, but can you actually point to real life case studies where clear language, easy to process information has saved lives? I'm glad she asked me, because when I looked, I actually found some pretty cool examples. So from one study, pregnant smokers and ex-smokers who received a specially designed intervention with materials written at the 3rd grade reading level were more likely to achieve abstinence during pregnancy and 6 weeks postpartum than those who received standard materials, right? So these are people who were smoking while pregnant, and when they were given this information at an easier to process level, performed better, right? They didn't smoke as much, and they didn't smoke even after they'd had their children. Another one, a plain language pictogram-based intervention used as part of medication counseling resulted in decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence among multi-ethnic, low socioeconomic status caregivers whose children were treated at an urban pediatric emergency department, right? So again, plain language pictogram-based, very easy to process, and decreased dosing errors and improved adherence. And anyone who works in healthcare knows adherence is one of the biggest issues in medication, right? Even if you can get the person the medication, the odds of them actually sticking to their regimen are very surprisingly low. Now, you might be saying that's great, but can you honestly point to an example where rhyming actually saved lives? Glad you asked. there was a campaign not too long ago called Click It or Ticket. And the idea was it would be, you would get a ticket if you weren't wearing your seatbelt. And there was a legislative aspect to it, right? The actual law. And that did pretty good, but mostly among older people. For younger people, it still wasn't quite taking hold. So Click It or Ticket was part of the media campaign that accompanied this new law. And as it turned out, national belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. And to put that in real numbers, for each percentage point you go up in seatbelt use, you're saving 270 lives. So that's almost 4,000 lives saved through rhyming. It's silly, but it works. Now, there is actual law around some of this. There are federal plain language guidelines. There was a federal Plain Language Act of 2010 that basically said if you're a government receiving, if you're a website receiving federal funds for providing services, you better be talking about those services using plain language. And I highly recommend 18F, that's 18F. They have amazing plain language guidelines that even if you're not working in government, you should check out. Another kind of weird visual quirk is how we think about pricing. So usually when you have an item on sale, the idea is that you take the sale price and you put it next to the original price and you like slash out the original price. If you make the original price visually further from the sale price, it'll look like a better deal, even if it's the same number. And what's even weirder about this one is that it only works if it's horizontal distance. For whatever reason, we equate horizontal distance with price distance. Another easy to process thing is name pronunciation. There's a name pronunciation effect. And if a name is easier to pronounce in whatever culture that is, right? It varies from culture to culture what's easy to pronounce. But if that name is easier to pronounce, it can basically make people feel better about you, right? It can affect voting and all sorts of preferences. My favorite version of this is they did a study where they looked at law firms, and the further up you went the chain in the law firm, the easier the names got to pronounce. This even extends to stocks. So if you have a stock that's about to IPO and the name of the stock is easier to pronounce, it'll perform better. If even that little abbreviation, the stock ticker abbreviation is easier to pronounce, the stock will perform better. So we're willing to lay cash money down on things that are easier to process. Another kind of visual cue we see is this thing called primacy. And it's the idea that the higher up something is in a list, you'll remember that better than something in the middle of the list, right? So we put a lot of emphasis and authority to things that are kind of at the top. So Amazon had a problem with this because when they rolled out reviews, people would look at the first review and assume it was the most authoritative review, when in fact it was just the most recent review. So they created this thing called helpfulness, right? You could read a review and say this was helpful or not. And they would take the most helpful reviews and put those at the top, which was better. But if it was a positive review, people would assume it's a good product, and if not, not. So they started putting the most helpful positive review right next to the most helpful critical review, giving them equal visual weight, which forced you, the user, to give them equal authority. There's this thing called the bandwagon effect. And it's pretty much what you think it is, right? If a whole bunch of people are doing something, you feel like it's probably a good idea for you to be doing it too. A great example is an experiment where you have someone look at this and say, okay, here's exhibit 1. Tell me A, B, or C, which of those lines is most like exhibit 1? And if we're just one-on-one, you look at that and you say, oh, A, obviously, right? But we don't do that. Instead, I put you in a room with 12 other people, and they all get to go first, and they all say B. So by the time I get to you, you say B, right? And they'll ask people afterwards, and they'll say things like, well, I wasn't sure if, I understood the question correctly, or I thought maybe everyone else knew something I didn't know. The key to unlocking the bandwagon effect is if even one other person in that room says A, you are far more likely to say A. So it's important when we're collaborating that the dissenters have line of sight to each other, or that nobody has line of sight to each other. I don't know how many of you have ever done a retro where you're sort of asking for a sprint or a project, what worked, what didn't work, what can we do better next time? There's a couple different ways to run that, right? You could run that and just get a bunch of people in a room and say, hey, what worked, right? And people can raise their hand and say whatever. But the problem is if they all say this worked and you don't think it worked, the more people who say it worked, the less likely you are to speak your mind. Or You can say, okay, what worked? Everybody write down on stickies what worked. We'll gather them all up and put them on the board and like affinity map them. Then you'll get a fairer response because I don't know what you said, and so I'm not influenced by it. The most dangerous bias in the world, in my opinion, is the framing effect. And it starts out innocent enough. You could have go into a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean. And right next to it, there's a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which beef do you think people are going to buy? It's the same beef, but the way it's been framed makes one seem preferable to the other. And that's all good and well when we're talking about beef. But what if I say, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? See what I did there? We're no longer talking about whether or not we should be going to war in the first place. And believe me, wars have been started over less. Now, if any of you are bilingual or speak more than one language, you have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you think about the decision in your non-native language, you are less likely to fall for the trick. So I speak a very little bit of French. So if I were to think about the beef decision in French, it would go something like this. Let's see, beef, that's bœuf, that's a lot of vowels. 95%, that's like 89, right? And by the time I get through all of that, I can see right through the illusion. The seminal text on cognitive bias is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And in Bias After Bias, what he's demonstrating is that you're just thinking too fast, right? If you can slow down that thinking, you'll cause less errors, right? And that thinking in a different language forces you to slow down your thinking. Now, the framing effect can actually be used for good. So there's an experiment where you show a whole bunch of people this photo and you say, should this person drive this car? And what you get is a policy discussion. And some people are saying, oh, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And other people are saying, that's ageist, what are you talking about? People should do what they want. And all you're going to learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now you can show the same photo to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what you'll get is a design discussion. And some people will say, well, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? Or what if we move the dashboard? And what you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. Now, I only changed 2 words in that entire thing, but changed the frame, changed the conversation. In fact, what if I were to say, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why that guy was in that car in the first place, because he was here and he wanted to be there. So the real issue is how do we get him there, right? Now, if you frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. We even see this play out in teacher evaluations. So again, this is an area where gender discrimination and racial discrimination happen. Women and people of color tend to be rated lower than their fellow professors for their work and for their classes. So in these student evaluations, they did an experiment where they had a couple paragraphs that some people got before they filled out their teacher evaluation, basically saying this is an area where people are generally discriminated against. Please make sure that you're basing your decisions on the quality of the course and the quality of the teaching. The people who got that framing judged women and people of color higher than people who did not. I want to finish by talking about our own cognitive biases, though, because these are the ones that can really be dangerous for our users. One of these is notational bias. And this is a bias where you basically have a way that you see the world and that translates into the products you create. So I played saxophone when I was a kid and I had to learn how to read sheet music like this. And I used to think that all music could be noted this way. Like this is how you capture any music that gets created. As it turns out, that's not even near true. There's all sorts of African and Asian music where this is completely inadequate for trying to capture, write down that music. But if we make this the standard, it's very easy to just gloss over and disappear all sorts of culture, right? A more common version of this is forums where we're asking for personal information, right? If I have it in my head that there is only male and female, and I create my forms that way, I'm eradicating so many different identities. By the way, while we're talking about asking for personal information, you should know about self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is a bias where if something went right, it's my fault, and if something went wrong, it's your fault. And this translates to computers. If I'm using a computer and something goes wrong, all things being equal, I blame the computer if it goes wrong. I blame myself if it goes right, unless I have given that computer personal information. The more personal information I give the computer, the more likely I am to blame myself if something goes wrong and blame the computer if something goes right. So there are many reasons we need to be very conservative and careful about asking for personal information. But here's another one. The more we do it, the more we are engendering a potentially unhealthy relationship between people and computers. Just something to keep in mind. Another example of this is kind of the way we structure language. So until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. It was either Miss or Mrs. So at the first mention of a woman's name, you would use her full name. Every subsequent mention, you had to say Miss last name or Mrs. last name. And the message this sends over and over again, in article after article, is that the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she's married, and then maybe her name, right? And because it's a structured language, it builds up a pattern. We've already seen how important and potentially destructive patterns are. So we need to be very careful about the rules and the structures we build for language, because again, they can scale biases. Language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. This is Mbimu Kagomu from IBM. And it's not just true metaphorically, like it's legally true. So back when Dick Cheney became vice president, there's all sorts of things he wanted to try, and he was trying to learn from his lawyers, okay, how much leeway do I have here with the things I want to do? And they say, okay, well, look, you are vice president, which means you are part of the executive branch, but you also cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, which means you're part of the legislative branch. But you can't be in both the executive branch and the legislative branch, so maybe you're in neither. And if you're in neither, you don't have to submit to the rules of either. And he didn't. We see the same argument play out today with big tech companies like Facebook. When it suits them, they say, we are a publisher. New York Times, come and publish with us. We're a great publisher. When someone points out that, oh, there are rules for publishers, they say, whoa, I don't know what you heard, buddy. We're a platform. Now, there are tools out there to help us think about writing and how to write for people who don't usually get much say in how they're written about. Radical Copy Editor is one of them. I highly recommend you check out. There's also Textio, which is really particularly good if you're hiring and when you want more inclusive hiring, because not everybody wants to be a rock star or a ninja. Another term I really want us to start thinking about is evidentiality. And this is something that a lot of other languages have, but English doesn't. And basically, it's a way to use verb tense. In English, we use verb tense mostly to denote when something happened, right? So Bob went to the store, Bob is going to the store, Bob will go to the store. But other languages like Turkish make verb tense do a little more heavy lifting. So they use verb tense to indicate how I know Bob went to the store, right? So there's one verb tense for I saw Bob go to the store. There's another verb tense for somebody told me Bob went to the store. And there's a whole other verb tense for like, I read it on the internet. The point is, I can't tell you that Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know Bob went to the store. And in this day and age, it is, let's say, important to know the veracity of the things that we say. And imagine how that would impact, right, what people decide to post to the web if they were on the hook for how they know it. And they couldn't post it without also indicating how they know what they're talking about. Like I said, English doesn't have this, but we can use some of the rules that we already learned about design and cognitive bias to maybe introduce it. So for example, this is an article that came out a few months ago about a teaser trailer that had dropped for the new James Bond movie, right? And the first paragraph is all confirmable facts, who's in it, what it's called. The second paragraph is about a rumor about why the first director got kicked off the project. And the second paragraph is harder to read. Now we know that things that are easier to read are easier to believe. We know that things that are harder to read are harder to believe. And in this case, that should be harder to believe because it's a rumor. So we've made it harder to read. What if we aligned how easy something was to read with how true it was or verifiable it was? This is just one riff on that, but I encourage all of you to start playing with this idea. Told you we'd come back to this one. So for a long time, I had a pretty big misinterpretation as to how the scientific method worked, right? My thought was that you have an idea in your head and you test that idea. And if you get the same result and you get the same result and we all get the same result and we're right, great, let's move on to the next idea. After talking to some actual scientists, I found it looks a lot more like this. I have an idea about how the world works and I do a test to see if I'm right. And if I'm right, great. And you all get the same result, great. Now I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to think, if I'm wrong, what else would be true? And then I have to go prove that. That's much more like the real scientific process, which is much more rigorous. And it was invented specifically to combat confirmation bias. And it is very easy for us to leave, good design or good code or good approaches on the table. And I'll show you how easy it is. So let's say we're going to play a game with the computer, and the computer says, okay, you get to put whatever number where that question mark is you want, and I'll tell you if that number fits the pattern, right? And then put in as many numbers as you like, and when you think you know the pattern, let me know, and I'll tell you if you're right. So if you're like me, you try out 8, and the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. And then it'll ask, do you want to try another number? And if you're me, you say, no, I got this, hold my beer. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says, no, you're wrong. And I'm wrong because I didn't try this. The pattern was not even numbers. The pattern was every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution. But I never ran across that solution because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. I never even looked to check to see if there was a better solution out there. And it is so easy for us to leave good design on the table. And God forbid, our client falls in love with the design we've come up with before we've had a chance to check it, right? Now, there are solutions to kind of help us from falling into this trap. And one of them is called red team, blue team. And it's a technique that both the military and journalists use. And let's pause to consider how rare that statement is. But basically, you have a blue team. And they go and they come up with the basic design, they do the research, they do the work, and they get into a place where you can talk about it. Maybe even they have some wireframes. And then the red team comes in for one day. And the red team's job is to go to war with the blue team. They're there to find out every nook and cranny, everything that the blue team might have missed, every possible cause of harm the blue team might have missed because they were so in love with their initial idea. Now, I like this approach because it's cost effective. I don't have to go to my COO and say, hey, guess what? For every project, we need to spin up 2 teams now, right? And they have to check each other's work every day. No, I need one team for one day just to make sure we're not putting something harmful out into the world. Another really fun tool for this red team stuff is called speculative design. And it's basically thinking about that unhappy path like we talked about before, but in a creative way. So I don't know how many of you have ever watched Black Mirror, but it's basically like the Twilight Zone, but for tech. So you think of some near future tech and you think about how would people actually use it? And you tell a story about that. And it's usually awful. I am convinced that anybody working on a new technology should be required by law to write a Black Mirror episode about it. This is a real job. And there is a group called Superflex. And one of my favorite stories is they went to the United Arab Emirates to help them figure out what the future of energy should be. And should they go into renewable? Should they continue down the path of fossil fuels? And they said, okay, let's talk about what would happen. Let's speculate what would happen if you went down the course of fossil fuels. And they looked at the data to figure out what would your air quality be like in like 2028, 2034 if you continue down this path. And they didn't just figure it out, they bottled it. They created it and they bottled it and they had them breathe it. And by the time you get to like 2028 or so, it was unbreathable. Causation or correlation, but by the time that conference was over, they said they were going to invest, I think, 150 billion with a B dollars in renewables. The last bias I want to talk about is called déformation professionnelle. Told you I spoke French. Basically, this is the bias where you see the entire world through the lens of your job. And in our workaholic society, that might seem like a good idea until it isn't. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road probably thought they were doing a good job. And technically speaking, they were. They were getting really difficult to get photos that were going to fetch them a very, very high sum. But what they weren't doing a great job of was being human beings. Now, when the former police commissioner of Philadelphia took the job, he asked his officers, what do you think your job is? And many of them would say to enforce the law. And he would say, it's a reasonable answer, but what if I were to tell you your job is to protect civil rights? Now that encompasses enforcing the law, but it's a bigger job than that. Their jobs were harder than they think, right? And that definition of the job gives them permission and a mandate to treat other people like human beings. Now, I will submit that our jobs are harder than we think. Our jobs aren't simply make cool shit, right? We have to think of a way to define our jobs that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, a lot of people are working on this. Mike Montero produced a little design ethics mini booklet that kind of acts as a first do no harm tech pledge for designers. The Markula Center for Applied Ethics has a wonderful decision-making framework for helping you think through the design of the solution you're creating using very, very old standard ethical questions. There's also the tarot cards of tech, which I love. And it's basically this interaction where you can click on these different cards and they'll flip around and show you different questions you can ask. How might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your product change cultural habits? If Twitter had asked these questions in its inception, we might have had a very different product in a very different world today. There's a great 52 UX cards to discover cognitive biases set that you can print out. And if you go to their website, they also have all these really cool exercises you can use. Humane by Design is almost like a design system for ethical tech. It's a beautiful website. And again, it helps you think through all these different patterns and rules you can use to make your product more inclusive and ethical. The software world has been thinking about this for years. There was the Never Again pledge, which really started to come to the fore when people working with data were starting to be asked to do some relatively unethical things with that data. And they said, no, we're putting our foot down. Here's a list of things that we are not going to do. And we even see this play out in places like Google, where you had Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. And a whole bunch of software engineers got together and said, look, we didn't get into this business to create weapons. We are going to say no. And so they basically almost staged a walkout, and Google said they relented. And they walked away from a $250 million contract. Now they turned right around and did Dragonfly, which is sensor search in China. And we still haven't resolved this one yet. But you can see that people collected together can have actual power. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this isn't some software guru at a TED Talk. This is Martin Luther King. 50 years ago, he saw this, and it's only more true today. So the question I'll ask us, the challenge I'll give us today, is how can we think of our jobs? How can we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very awesome. And I feel like I learned a ton of stuff. And I don't know. I felt like I've even kind of learned about some biases. And I don't know, there was some stuff in there that blew my mind. So let's see here. I think there's some questions in the Slack.
And I'm going to drop a little bit of thing in Slack right now. That's just, okay. If you want to get in touch with me after, you can sign up for virtual coffee. And like I said, I am working on a book, so that link's in there too if you want to learn more about that. But bring on the questions.
Let me find the first one. So this question was from Doug Carpenter. He said, in respect to making things easy to process, is there a limit to how simple you want to make it? For instance, if you can make a concept simple and rhyme, will every audience take it seriously, or is it more likely to be dismissed if it's too simple?
That's a good question. I mean, I tend to think no, and here's why. One of the things, whenever people look at a bias and do tests around biases, one of the things they look at is different factors like intelligence, right? Are smarter people less susceptible to this bias than people who have a less education, right? What they consistently find is it is either the same or worse. There's all sorts of biases around like how good you are at making predictions, right? And they'll do things around like law, medicine, whatever. And they'll give lawyers and lay people the same information, and both of them will make the same mistakes, right? If this particular bias they're looking for. So I suspect that it is almost impossible to dumb something down too much. Now there's a degree of branding involved, right? And so if you have a message that, and when I say branding, you could be talking about political parties, you could be talking about clothing, fashion, whatever, where your tribe, your brand, your fandom, right, has a certain way of talking, a certain way of speaking, a certain thing they believe about themselves. And you don't want to necessarily go against that. You can run afoul of that. But in terms of simplicity, people are vulnerable. Like we love things that are easy to process as long as they don't really conflict with our own identity.
I did create a new channel in case these questions kind of go longer. I called it Fight Bias, so I will make sure I put a thing in there. But I think we got a question somewhere in here.
I'm seeing in the chat someone asking about resources. Once we create that new channel, I'll drop like a bunch of resources in there for you.
Okay, awesome. So here, I will put that in there now. Normally, I mark all the questions with thinking faces as it's going on. But now that it's, This is my first time hosting a virtual conference. So Adina Halter asked, can you discuss your thoughts on ableist versus disability biases?
Sure. I mean, to be honest, that's where a lot of this started. A lot of the strictures and things we're going to have to build to sort of like make people accountable for a lot of the ethical bias stuff I'm talking about are all based on how the evolution of accessibility in general, right? That goes back to, you didn't really see real movement on this until the Americans for Disabilities Acts came through and gave you a foundation for holding companies liable for making their websites accessible. And that's been an ongoing fight, but the progress we made there has, to be perfectly frank, been a lot of, yes, some people have a heart for it, but some people don't want to get sued and some people don't want to run afoul of the law. And I think we're going to see that same thing play out in a grander way around ableist versus not. And I can tell you right now, I run afoul of this too. It's the same thing in terms of overlooking the needs of people who are differently abled, right? So when people are designing things, I can tell you that for one day, I had my pupils dilated, right, for some, vision test. And so for the rest of that day, I was like useless on a computer. And the only thing I could do is try to enlarge things, right? So I got a very, very, very thin slice of what it's like to have a certain type of limitation in terms of what I could see. And I very quickly found out who my friends were in terms of which websites made it easier to see and which ones didn't. But again, that's not something I would have thought about otherwise, because it didn't fit my pattern, right? It didn't fit the life, my lived experience. And so in an answer that's probably bigger than your question, but it kind of reiterates for me something, which is I always want to have input from the most diverse group of people when designing, because I don't have that lived experience, but other people do. And that's going to be the first thing they think of. So I don't know if that's exactly answering your question, but that's kind of what I'm thinking of when I think about like how that's going to play out. But I'd say a lot of this approach is rooted in one of the first areas of bias that I think people started tackling on the web was accessibility and not thinking about differently abled people and their needs when designing the web.
Serge Corin asked, well, first they said excellent talk, and then they want to know, why do we have biases?
To live. I mean, pick your bias, and there's a perfectly good reason. Most of them come back to some kind of evolutionary biology, right? So I'll give you a really good one that's kind of relevant now. We are prone to believe in apocalypse theories and apocalypse. So like the Mayan prediction that the world was going to end in 2012, we are so prone to believe stuff like that. Part of the reason is going back to the time when you didn't know if that rustling in the grass was the wind or a tiger. The people who believed it was a tiger and were wrong passed on their genes. The people who didn't believe it was a tiger and were wrong did not. So basically the people who were a little more paranoid were more likely to pass on that paranoid gene than the people who didn't. And again, these days, that's not as useful a trait, but it has a very old social history, right? And you can point it to just about any bias. And in the right context, it's a super useful trait. Even like self-confidence biases, right? There's an optimism bias. And it's basically the bias where 50% of marriages end in divorce. But if you ask any married couple, they'll say the odds of us ending up in divorce are not 50%, right? That's a bias. However, it's a good bias. It gets you out of bed in the morning. It lets you try new ventures that are risky, right? And in fact, not having that bias can actually be a sign of depression. So all these things have their uses. The problem is in the wrong context, they can be harmful. But we have all sorts of reasons for the biases to be there. And in the past, they were more useful. Oh, and I'll put the URL for the cool UX cards in the new Slack channel when I get there. I have a whole list of resources I'll put in there.
I think if nobody else has any questions, we can wrap this up, and then David will post the resources to the Slack channel. It's Fight Bias. It's still at the bottom. Unless anyone else has another question, we still have about 9 minutes left. If you feel like we're probably good to wrap it up and just take it to their Slack channel. Again, thank you so much. This was
cool.
Seriously awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks. Glad you liked it. I'll meet people over in the Slack channel.
Awesome.